There is nothing more pathetic than a bedside repentance. I see it every day. Families sobbing over ventilators, desperate for cheap absolution after decades of neglect. I am Dr. Ella Gibson, and I have no patience for theatrics. My parents discarded me at a truck stop when I was 16 because my illness was a financial liability. They traded me for my brother's hockey gear. Today they crawled back because I am the only surgeon who can save my father. The irony is suffocating. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spend here with us. Now the gallery is full, and the show must begin. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in an operating room. It isn't the absence of sound, but the absence of chaos. Under the bright, shadowless LED lights, the world outside ceases to exist. There are no bills, no politics, no past, and no future. There is only the rhythm of the ventilator, the steady, reassuring beep of the cardiac monitor, and the precise movement of my hands. I am Dr. Ella Gibson, Chief of Surgery at St. Jude's Memorial. And in this room, I am God, or at least the closest thing to it that science allows. I extended my hand without looking up, feeling the cold steel of the retractor slap into my palm. Suction. I commanded my voice, flat and controlled. Across the table, Sarah, my head nurse, moved with a fluidity that matched my own. We didn't need to speak. After 12 years, Sarah knew my moves before I made them. She was 62, with eyes that had seen everything human beings could do to one another, and hands that were as steady as granite. To the hospital administration, she was a veteran employee. To me, she was the woman who had scraped me off the pavement when the world threw me away. But we didn't talk about that in the OR. Here, we were professionals. Closing, I announced, stepping back as the resident moved in to suture. I peeled off my gloves with a sharp snap, the sound echoing in the tiled room. The surgery had been perfect, a textbook repair of a mitral valve that anyone else in the state would have deemed inoperable. That was why I was the chief. That was why the hospital board tolerated my rigid demands and my absolute refusal to engage in donor dinners. My value was in my hands. I walked to the scrub sink, the hot water scalding my skin in a way that felt grounding. Sarah appeared beside me, scrubbing out in silence. She caught my eye in the reflection of the stainless steel. "You were pushing it today, Ella," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the running water. "You only go that fast when you're running from something." I stiffened slightly. Sarah could read me like an open chart. "Just focused," I lied, drying my hands with a rough paper towel. "The gala is tonight. You know how I feel about schmoozing with the trustees." Sarah chuckled, a warm, rasping sound that always made the sterile hallway feel a little less cold. "It's part of the job, Chief. They pay for the lights. You save the lives. It's a symbiosis." We walked together down the pristine white corridor, the heels of my shoes clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm on the linoleum. I loved this hospital. I loved the smell of antiseptic and the hum of the HVAC system. It was a fortress. It was safe. Outside these walls, life was messy and unpredictable. Inside, everything had a protocol. Everything had a cure. Or if not a cure, a reason. I was halfway to my office, mentally preparing to change into civilian clothes and endure a night of polite conversation with wealthy donors when the overhead page crackled. Dr. Gibson to the ICU intake. Stat. I stopped. A page to intake. I was a surgeon, not an ER resident. If they were paging the chief of surgery to intake, it meant something catastrophic had happened, or someone very important had just arrived. I looked at Sarah, her brow furrowed. "I'll come with you," she said, her tone shifting instantly from maternal to clinical. We pivoted, heading toward the elevators. The ride down was silent, the tension mounting with every floor we passed. When the doors slid open on the ICU floor, the chaos hit me. Alarms were blaring in the distance and nurses were rushing between bays. But standing at the central desk was the hospital administrator, looking pale and clutching a clipboard like a shield. "Dr. Gibson," he said, rushing toward me. "Thank God, we have a transfer. It's a delicate situation." I crossed my arms, my white coat feeling like armor. I don't do transfers, Marcus. I do surgeries. Why am I here? Marcus swallowed hard. The patient is a transfer from out of state, severe aortic dissection. He's unstable. The referring hospital said he needs the Gibson procedure. They said you're the only one who can do it. I felt a flicker of pride. The Gibson procedure, a technique I had pioneered 3 years ago for rebuilding aortic walls in high-risk patients. It was the reason I was the youngest chief in the hospital's history. Okay, I said, my mind already shifting into tactical mode. Prepping an OR, send me the scans. Who is the patient? Marcus hesitated. He looked down at the clipboard, then back at me, his eyes shifting nervously to Sarah and then back to my face. Dr. Gibson, the family insisted on the transfer. They specifically requested this facility because of your reputation. But the names on the file triggered a conflict of interest flag in the system, but we overrode it because of the emergency. I frowned. Conflict of interest? I don't have family, Marcus. You know that. I reached out and snatched the clipboard from his hands. My eyes scanned the intake form. The world stopped. The noise of the ICU, the beeping monitors, the shouting nurses, the rolling gurneys, all of it vanished into a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The name at the top of the chart was typed in bold black letters, Patient Robert Gibson. Dobie, 03/12/1958. My breath hitched in my throat. I knew that date. I knew it because I used to write it on Father's Day cards that were never read. I forced my eyes to move down the page, hoping, praying it was a coincidence. Next of kin Martha Gibson, wife. Kyle Gibson, son. The clipboard shook in my hand. The sterile air of the hospital suddenly felt suffocating, hot and heavy, like the desert air of a gas station on the side of a highway in Nevada. A memory sharp and violent slashed through my composure. I was 16 years old again. I was sitting on a curb clutching a small duffel bag, my chest burning with the pleurisy that they refused to treat because the copay was money down the drain. I remembered the heat radiating off the asphalt. I remembered the car engine idling. I remembered my mother Martha refusing to look at me staring straight ahead through the windshield. I remembered my father Robert leaning out the window. We can't do this anymore, Ella, he had said, his voice devoid of emotion, just a calculated assessment of a bad investment. Kyle made the varsity team. The travel costs, the camps. We can't afford your specialists and his future. You're old enough to figure this out. It's time you learn to survive on your own. And I remembered Kyle, my golden brother. He was in the back seat wearing his headphones, tapping on his Game Boy. He didn't even look up as they drove away. He didn't wave. He just let them leave me there, sick and penniless, 100 miles from home. I had watched their taillights fade into the dust, realizing that to them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a line item in a budget, and they had just balanced the books. Ella, Sarah's voice snapped me back to the present. Her hand was on my arm, her grip tight, grounding me. I looked at her. Her face was pale. She had seen the names, too. She knew. She was the one who had found me 3 days after they left me, collapsed in a shelter, delirious with fever. She was the one who nursed me back to health, who paid for medical school, who signed the adoption papers when I turned 18, just so I would never be an orphan again. It's them, I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It's actually them. Marcus, oblivious to the history, looked between us nervously. Dr. Gibson, the patient is crashing. His pressure is dropping. If we don't get him to the OR in the next 20 minutes, the dissection will rupture and he will die. The family is in the waiting room. They are demanding to see the surgeon. I looked down at the chart again. Robert Gibson, the man who had discarded me like a broken toy, was now lying on a gurney 100 feet away, his heart literally tearing itself apart. And the irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. He needed the Gibson procedure. My procedure? The technique created by the daughter he claimed was too expensive to keep. I was the only person in the world who could save him. I had spent 15 years building a fortress of success, layering accolades and wealth and skill around myself so that I would never be vulnerable again. I thought I was safe. But now, the past had breached the perimeter. I looked at the double doors leading to the waiting room. Behind them were the people who had taught me that love was conditional. They were terrified. They were powerless. And they had no idea that the Dr. Gibson they were pinning their hopes on was the girl they had left to die. I closed the chart with a heavy thud. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a chaotic drumbeat of rage and grief. I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were fierce, protective, waiting for my signal. I could walk away. I could transfer him to another surgeon, knowing he would likely die on the table. It would be easy. It would be fair. But then I looked at my hands. The hands that Sarah had held when I was shivering with fever. The hands she had taught to be strong. I wasn't the victim on the curb anymore. I was the chief of surgery. Prep or one, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, cold and distant. I need to speak to the family. If you have gone through the pain of abandonment or felt the cold sting of betrayal from the people who were supposed to protect you, please leave a comment below. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The corridor leading to the VIP pre-operative holding area is known among the staff as the Green Mile, though never in front of the patients. It is long carpeted in a hushed, expensive gray and lined with abstract art meant to soothe the wealthy and the desperate. Walking it now, the distance felt infinite. Every step I took was a battle between the surgeon who had sworn an oath to do no harm and the abandoned child screaming inside my head to burn it all down. Sarah walked beside me, her presence a silent, solid wall against the tremors threatening to shake my hands. She didn't offer platitudes. She knew better. She just matched my stride, her rubber-soled nurse shoes squeaking softly against the floor, a counter-rhythm to the sharp, authoritative click of my heels. "He's in Suite 4, Sarah murmured, checking the digital chart on her tablet. "Vitals are thready. BP is 80/40. If we're going to move Ella, we have to move now." I nodded, my face a mask of professional detachment. "I know the numbers, Sarah. I need to see the patient." I refused to call him father. To call him that would be to grant him a title he had abdicated 15 years ago on the side of Interstate 80. I stopped in front of the heavy oak door of Suite 4. I took a breath, holding it in my lungs for a count of 3, a technique Sarah had taught me to control panic attacks during my first year of med school, and then I pushed the door open. The room was large, designed to look more like a hotel suite than a hospital room, but the smell was the same, fear and antiseptic. In the center of the room, lying on the stretcher, was Robert. He looked smaller than I remembered. The imposing giant who used to loom over me, lecturing me about the cost of my medications, was now a gray, withered man, hooked up to a symphony of beeping machines. His eyes were half open, glassy, and unfocused. Standing by his head, gripping the bed rail with white knuckles, was Martha. She had aged poorly. The bitterness etched around her mouth had deepened into permanent fissures. And then there was Kyle. My brother, the investment, was sitting in the plush armchair in the corner, one leg bouncing restlessly. He wasn't looking at his dying father. He was scrolling through his phone, his face illuminated by the blue light, wearing an expression of mild annoyance, as if this medical emergency were a traffic jam making him late for a movie. He wore a faded varsity jacket that looked 2 sizes too small, straining at the shoulders, a relic of the glory days that had cost me my childhood. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. I stepped fully into the light. "I'm Dr. Gibson," I said, my voice projecting clearly the same tone I used to command a room full of residents. "I'm the chief of surgery. I'll be handling this case." Martha's head snapped up. Her eyes widened, scanning my face, my white coat, the ID badge clipped to my lapel. For a moment, there was only confusion. She saw a confident, successful woman in her late 20s. She didn't see the sick, shivering teenager she had discarded. "Dr. Gibson," she stammered, hope flaring in her eyes. "Oh, thank God. They said you were the best. They said—" She stopped. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. Her gaze locked onto the small crescent-shaped scar above my eyebrow. A souvenir from a fall I took the day before they left me a cut they hadn't bothered to stitch because Band-Aids are cheaper. Her mouth fell open. Ella. The name hung in the air, foreign and heavy. Kyle looked up from his phone, squinting. Ella, he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. No way. He stood up, shoving his phone into his pocket. He didn't look relieved. He looked like someone trying to calculate the odds of a bet he had already lost. I didn't flinch. I didn't step forward to hug them. I stood at the foot of the bed, gripping the patient file like a shield. Hello, Martha. Kyle. I didn't address Robert. He was barely conscious, his breathing ragged. Martha took a stumbling step toward me, reaching out a trembling hand. I took a sharp step back. Please don't, I said, my voice ice cold. I am here as your doctor, nothing else. Martha's hand dropped, but her survival instinct, the same instinct that had made her choose a son's hockey gear over a daughter's insulin, kicked in instantly. Her shock morphed into a twisted form of vindication. Look at you, she breathed, a nervous smile twitching on her lips. I knew it. I told Robert. I told him you were a survivor. We knew you'd land on your feet, Ella. We knew you just needed a push. The rage flared in my chest, hot and blinding. A push. They had left me with $20 and a bag of clothes at a truck stop because my autoimmune disorder was draining the savings account they wanted to use for Kyle's travel league. A push, I repeated, my voice dropping an octave. You left a 16-year-old girl at a gas station in Nevada. You changed your phone numbers. You told the police I ran away. We did it for you, Martha cried, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. We were drowning, Ella. We couldn't afford the treatments and Kyle's training. We had to make a choice. And look, she gestured wildly at my white coat at the expensive suite at the Chief of Surgery Embroidery. It worked. You made something of yourself. If we had kept coddling you, you'd just be another sick girl draining the system. We gave you independence. The audacity was breathtaking. It was a masterclass in rewriting history. She was actually trying to take credit for my success, claiming that her cruelty was a strategic parenting decision. I looked at Kyle. He was watching me, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at the diamond studs in my ears, the Swiss watch on my wrist, the quality of the fabric of my coat. So, Kyle said, a smirk playing on his lips, totally at odds with the fact that his father was dying 3 feet away. You're the chief, huh? Must pay pretty well. Mom said you were too expensive to keep, but looks like you're doing just fine now. Shut up, Kyle, Sarah snapped from behind me. It was the first time she had spoken, and her voice was like a whip crack. Kyle blinked, surprised by the intrusion, but I didn't need Sarah to fight this battle. I looked at my brother, the golden child. He hadn't made the NHL. He hadn't even made the minors. I could see it in the way he carried himself, the heavy scent of cheap cologne trying to mask the smell of stale cigarettes. He was a washed-up, peaked-in high school failure, and I was the one holding the scalpel. Robert has a type A aortic dissection, I said, cutting through the personal drama with clinical precision. His aorta is tearing. Without surgery, he has maybe an hour. With surgery, he has a 60% chance on the table. I looked at Martha. The procedure requires a specific skill set. I am the only surgeon in the state qualified to perform it. You can transfer him, but he won't survive the ambulance ride. Martha fell to her knees. It was a theatrical, desperate gesture. She grabbed the rail of the bed. Please, Ella, please, you have to save him. He's your father. Family helps family. You can't let him die just to punish us. The room went silent. The monitor beeped. Beep, 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 marking the seconds slipping away. I looked at Robert's gray face. I remembered him handing me a warm soda at the gas station, telling me to wait here, and then driving away. I owed him nothing. Absolutely nothing. I could walk out. I could cite a conflict of interest. I could let nature take its course, and it would be justice. It would be karma. It's going to cost you, Kyle muttered, leaning back against the wall. But I guess you can afford to do a pro bono right, since you're so successful thanks to us. His arrogance was the final straw, but it didn't break me. It didn't break. It clarified things. If I let Robert die, I became them. I became someone who discarded people when they were inconvenient. I became someone who let money or bitterness dictate the value of a human life. I looked at Sarah. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She knew what I was going to do. I wasn't going to save him for them. I was going to save him for me, to prove that I was better, to prove that the burden was now the savior. I will operate, I said, my voice void of warmth, not because we are family, but because I took an oath, get him to or one. I turned on my heel, ignoring Martha's sobbing gratitude and Kyle's smug expression. As I walked out, Kyle called after me, "Hey, nice watch, sis. Maybe you can buy me one after you patch up the old man." I didn't look back. I just kept walking the fire in my belly, turning into cold, hard determination. They thought they had won. They thought they had manipulated me back into the fold. They had no idea that saving Robert was just the beginning. I was going to fix his heart, but in doing so, I was going to expose exactly how hollow theirs really were. If you've ever had a family member who only showed up when they needed something from you, or who tried to twist their past cruelty into some twisted form of love, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me your story. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The operating room was a sanctuary of cold blue light. "Scalpel," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the scrubbers. Sarah slapped the instrument into my palm instantly. I looked down at the exposed chest cavity of the man who had sired me. Under the sterile drapes, Robert was no longer a father, a villain, or a memory. He was anatomy. He was a puzzle of valves, arteries, and failing tissue that I had to solve. For 6 hours, I didn't think about the gas station. I didn't think about the cold nights in the shelter. I thought about the aortic arch. I thought about the tensile strength of the Dacron graft. I worked with a precision that bordered on mechanical, my hands moving with a speed that the residents watching from the gallery whispered about. "Clamp," I ordered, "stopping the heart now, going on bypass." The rhythmic swoosh of the heart-lung machine took over. Robert Gibson was technically dead, suspended in a state of controlled animation, his life entirely dependent on the daughter he had thrown away. "Graft is seated," I announced 3 hours later. "Rewarming the patient. Let's see if he wakes up." This was the moment of truth. I watched the monitor. The line was flat, then a spike, then another, a rhythm. "Sinus rhythm," the anesthesiologist called out, sounding relieved. "Pressure is stabilizing." I stepped back, letting out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I was 16. I had done it. I had saved him. I had saved. Not because I loved him, but because I refused to let his failure as a father dictate my failure as a doctor. "Close him up," I told the senior resident. "I'll speak to the family." I stripped off my gown, feeling the sweat cooling on my back. I felt a strange sense of hollowness. I expected to feel triumphant or perhaps angry, but I just felt tired. I had proven my point. I was the bigger person. I had given them the ultimate gift life, free of charge. But the universe, it seemed, wasn't done with the Gibson family yet. I was in the recovery room reviewing Robert's post-op labs when the alarms began to wail. A nurse sprinted past me. "Dr. Gibson, he's crashing disseminated intravascular coagulation." I dropped the tablet and ran. DIC? It was a nightmare scenario. His blood was refusing to clot, while simultaneously forming microclots throughout his body. He was bleeding out internally. I reached his bedside. The drain tubes were filling with bright red blood. "Push protamine," I yelled. "Get me FFP and platelets, stat." We worked on him for 20 minutes, stabilizing the pressure, but I knew what was happening. His body was rejecting the synthetic graft interface. It was a rare 1 in a million reaction to the polymer used in the Gibson procedure. "He's not stabilizing, doctor," the anesthesiologist said, his voice grim. "He's burning through factors faster than we can replace them. If we don't stop the reaction, he'll bleed out in an hour." I stared at the monitor. There was only one fix. It was an old-school, desperate immune modulation technique. He needs a direct, massive transfusion of granulocytes and stem cells from a first-degree genetic match. I said, my mind racing. We need to flood his system with familial antigens to trick the immune response into accepting the graft. It acts as a biological bridge. You? Sarah asked, looking at me. I shook my head. I can't. I have the autoimmune markers, the same ones that made me sickly as a kid. My blood would kill him instantly. I looked at the door. Kyle. I walked into the waiting room. Martha was pacing. Kyle was asleep in the chair, his mouth open, headphones on. He's out of surgery, I said loudly. Martha gasped, clutching her chest. Kyle jerked awake, pulling his headphones down. Is he dead? He asked, rubbing his eyes. He's alive, I said. But there is a severe complication. His body is rejecting the graft interface. He is bleeding internally. Martha let out a strangled sob. You said you fixed him. I did, I said sharply. The surgery was perfect. His biology is the problem, but there is a solution. We need a donor, someone with a direct genetic match to provide a massive stem cell and platelet transfer immediately. It will act as a biological anchor for the graft. I turned to Kyle. You are the only match, Kyle. Kyle blinked. Me. What do I have to do? Spit in a cup. No, I said. We need to hook you up to an apheresis machine. We need to harvest a significant amount of stem cells and clotting factors. It will take about 4 hours. 4 hours? Kyle checked his watch. Okay, that's annoying, but fine. Whatever. There is a recovery period, I added, needing to be ethically clear. Because of the volume we need to take to save him, you will be physically exhausted. You will likely experience deep bone ache, fatigue, and muscle weakness for about 2 to 3 weeks. You won't be able to engage in strenuous physical activity. The room went dead silent. Kyle's face changed. The annoyance vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look that chilled me to the bone. 2 weeks, he said slowly. I can't do anything physical for 2 weeks. Correct, I said. If you exert yourself, you could rupture your own spleen or suffer a collapse. You need bed rest. Kyle stood up. He picked up his duffel bag. Then I can't do it. Martha froze. What? I have the semi-pro tryouts in Chicago on Thursday. Kyle said, his voice steady. This is my last shot, Mom. The scout said if I show up and skate well, I might get a bench spot. If I don't show, or if I show up weak, I'm done. I'm aged out next year. Kyle, Martha whispered, her voice trembling. Your father is dying. In the other room. Dying. And I've been training for this for 10 years. Kyle shouted, his face turning red. You guys pushed me. You told me this was the dream. You spent every dime on this. And now you want me to throw it away so Dad can... What? Live another 5 years in a chair? He looked at me, pointing a finger. She's the doctor. Make her do it. She's the one with the magic hands. I can't, I said, calmly. My blood is toxic to him. You are the only one. If you walk out that door, he dies within the hour. Kyle looked at Martha. Then he looked at the door to the ICU. I watched his internal calculus. I watched him weigh the life of the man who had bought him every skate, every jersey, every camp, against a mediocre shot at a third-tier hockey league. It's too expensive, Kyle said. The words hit me like a physical slap. It was the exact phrase Robert had used to justify leaving me. She's too expensive. Kyle, Martha screamed, grabbing his arm. You can't be serious. He sacrificed everything for you. We left her for you. She pointed at me, her eyes wild. We sacrificed her so you could have this career. You owe him. Kyle ripped his arm away from his mother's grip. I didn't ask you to do that, he sneered. You guys did that because you wanted a winner. Well, winners don't quit. I'm going to Chicago. If you leave, I said, my voice low and dangerous, you are killing him. Make no mistake. This isn't nature taking its course. This is you deciding that your tryout is worth more than his life. Kyle looked at me with dead eyes. You're the rich doctor, Ella. You figure it out. Buy him a new heart or something. He hitched his bag onto his shoulder. Tell him, tell him, I hope he pulls through. And then, without looking back at his sobbing mother or the sister he had mocked, the golden child walked out the automatic doors. He chose a game over his father. He chose himself. Martha collapsed into the chair, wailing a raw, broken sound of a woman realizing that her entire life's investment had just walked out the door, leaving her bankrupt in every way that mattered. I stood there watching her. I felt a strange, cold sense of closure. I had offered mercy. I had offered my skill. But in the end, the values they had instilled in their son, selfishness, image, the pursuit of success at any cost, had come back to devour them. I need to get back to my patient, I said to the weeping woman. I will do what I can to keep him comfortable. I walked back toward the ICU. I wasn't going to save him. I couldn't. His son had just signed his death warrant. But as I scrubbed back in, I realized that Robert Gibson wasn't dying of a heart defect. He was dying of the very thing he had cultivated. If you have ever felt the pain of seeing someone you love choose a career, money, or their own ego over the life or well-being of a family member, please leave a comment below. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The silence in the intensive care unit is different from the silence in the operating room. In the OR, silence is focus. In the ICU, silence is usually a prelude to bad news. I stood at the foot of bed 4 watching the vitals monitor cycle through its numbers. Robert was alive. The graft held for now. We had managed to stabilize the bleeding with a cocktail of synthetic coagulants and a massive transfusion from the hospital bank. But it was a temporary patch on a leaking dam. Without the biological bridge from Kyle's stem cells, Robert's body was currently fighting a war against the very thing keeping him alive. He wasn't going to die tonight, but he wasn't going to walk out of here in a week either. He was looking at months of dialysis immunosuppressants that cost more than a luxury car, and a life tethered to machines. The anesthesia was wearing off. I saw his eyelids flutter. It was time for the conversation I had dreaded, yet strangely, the one I was most prepared for. Sarah stood by the window, her arms crossed. She hadn't left my side. She had watched Kyle walk out, and she had watched me go back to work with a stoicism that mirrored her own. "He's waking up," she whispered. I moved to the side of the bed. Robert's eyes opened, unfocused and milky. He blinked, trying to process the tube in his nose and the heaviness in his chest. His gaze found me. For a second, he looked confused. And then the memory of the gas station, the waiting room, the years of silence, it all came rushing back. He tried to speak, his voice a rasp against the dry air. "Kyle," he croaked. It was the first word out of his mouth. Not, "Thank you," not, "I'm sorry," but the name of the son who had just abandoned him. "He's not here. Robert," I said, my voice clinically detached. I checked the IV drip rate, refusing to make eye contact. The surgery was technically a success. The aneurysm is repaired. However, because we didn't get the donor tissue, your recovery is going to be complicated. Robert tried to lift his head, but the effort was too much. He slumped back against the pillow. "Where?" "He left," I said simply. "He has a tryout in Chicago. He didn't want to risk the recovery time." I watched the words hit him. I watched the realization sink in that the investment he had protected at all costs had just declared bankruptcy on him. A single tear leaked out of the corner of his eye, tracking through the wrinkles of a man who had aged 20 years in a day. Before he could respond, the glass door to the ICU bay slid open with a violent hiss. Martha burst in. She looked deranged. Her hair was coming loose from its bun, her eyes were red and swollen, and she carried the manic energy of someone looking for a scapegoat. She rushed to the bedside, grabbing Robert's hand. "Oh, thank God you're awake." She looked at me, her expression instantly hardening into a mask of pure venom. "You let him go," she hissed. "You let Kyle leave." I looked up from the chart. "I am a surgeon. Martha, not a jailer. Kyle is an adult. He made a choice." "You could have stopped him," she shrieked, her voice drawing the attention of the nurses at the station. You could have guilted him. You could have paid him. You have money now. You could have done something. I did do something. I said my patient's finally fraying. I performed a $400,000 surgery for free. I saved his life when every other doctor in the country would have turned him away. I did my job. It's not enough, she screamed, slamming her hand down on the tray table. Look at him. He's going to be a cripple. Who is going to pay for the care? Who is going to take care of him? Kyle is gone. He's gone because you didn't try hard enough to keep him here. You always were jealous of him. You wanted this to happen. The accusation was so absurd, so deeply twisted that I actually laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. Jealous? I asked. I just saved your husband's life and you're accusing me of sabotage because your golden child decided a hockey game was more important than his father. You're supposed to be family, Martha wailed, playing the card she had burned 15 years ago. After everything we did for you, enough. The word didn't come from me. It came from the window. Sarah stepped forward. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. Her voice had the weight of iron. She walked between me and Martha, effectively shielding me. Martha blinked, looking at the older woman in the nurse's scrubs. She had dismissed Sarah as help earlier, barely acknowledging her existence. Excuse me, Martha snapped. This is a private family matter. Get out. Sarah didn't move. She stood her ground, her posture perfect, her eyes blazing with a fire I had only seen once before, the day she found me shivering in that shelter. It became my matter the day you drove away from that Texaco station off I-80, Sarah said. Martha froze. Her face went slack. What? November 14th. Sarah recited the date like a verdict. You gave her a duffel bag. You gave her $20, and you told her that if she really loved you, she wouldn't be a burden anymore. Sarah took a step closer to Martha. I know, because I'm the one who found her. I'm the one who sat by her bed for 3 days while she screamed in her sleep, begging her daddy to come back. I'm the one who held her hair back while she threw up from the withdrawal of the medication you stopped buying. Robert let out a low groan from the bed, closing his eyes as if the words were physical blows. Martha turned pale, stepping back. You don't understand. It was hard times. We did what we had to do. No, Sarah cut her off. You did what was easy. You threw away a diamond because you were too lazy to polish it, and instead you spent every dime, every ounce of love polishing a stone. She gestured to the empty space where Kyle should have been. And now look, the stone has rolled away, and the diamond is the only reason you aren't planning a funeral right now. Martha looked at me, then back at Sarah. The dynamic in the room shifted tectonically. She realized for the first time that I wasn't alone. I wasn't the orphan she could bully. Who are you? Martha whispered. Sarah reached out and took my hand. Her grip was warm and rough and familiar. I'm the woman who raised her, Sarah said, her voice swelling with pride. I'm the one who went to her graduation. I'm the one who pinned her coat. I am her mother. You're just the woman who gave birth to her. The silence that followed was absolute. The beeping of the monitors seemed to grow louder, counting down the seconds of their humiliation. Martha looked at Robert, but he wouldn't look at her. He was staring at the ceiling, tears streaming silently into his ears. He realized the magnitude of his error. He had bet on the wrong child. He had sacrificed his morality for a son who viewed him as an ATM, and he had discarded the daughter who had become a savior. I'm sorry, Robert whispered. It was barely audible. Ella, I'm sorry. I looked at him. I felt a pang of pity, but it was distant, like looking at a stranger's tragedy on the news. I know, I said softly, but sorry doesn't pay for the care you're going to need, and sorry doesn't bring Kyle back. I turned to Martha. I've arranged for a transfer to the long-term care facility in Reno once he is stable. It's a state facility. It's what you can afford now. Martha gasped. State facility, but those places are adequate, I finished. They are adequate, just like the $20 you gave me was adequate. I checked the monitor one last time. I'll check on you in the morning. Nurse Sarah will monitor your vitals. I turned to Sarah. Ready to go, Mom? I asked, using the title deliberately. Sarah smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up the sterile room. Ready, doctor. We walked out of the ICU together, leaving Robert and Martha alone in the wreckage of the life they had built. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, bound by the choices they had made 15 years ago. As the doors slid shut behind us, I didn't feel the heavy weight of the past anymore. I felt light. If you have found a chosen family who loves you more than your biological family ever did, or if you've had to cut ties with toxic relatives to save yourself, I want to hear your story. Leave a comment below. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The sound of a pen scratching against paper is usually satisfying to me. It signifies completion, a case closed, a life saved. But as I stood at the nurse's station 3 days later, signing the discharge transfer orders for Robert Gibson, the sound felt like a gavel coming down. The scratching of the nib against the carbon copy was the only noise in the hallway. It was 4 a.m, the witching hour in the hospital where the only people awake are the insomniacs and the dying. I pressed down hard on the final signature, Dr. E. Gibson, Chief of Surgery, and capped my pen. It was done. Robert had survived the critical 48-hour window. The graft had held, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Without the stem cells from Kyle Roberts' kidneys had taken a massive hit from the hemolysis. He was stable, but he was a shell of the man he had been. He would need dialysis 3 times a week. He would need physical therapy. He would need a level of care that cost thousands of dollars a month, money they simply didn't have. I handed the clipboard to the charge nurse. Arrange transport, I said quietly. Standard ambulance. No lights, no sirens. He's going to Gentle Hills. The nurse raised an eyebrow. Gentle Hills was a state-subsidized long-term care facility 2 counties over. It wasn't a dungeon, but it wasn't the Ritz either. It was functional. It was clean. It was exactly what the state provided for indigent patients with no insurance and no assets. It was adequate. Dr. Gibson, the nurse hesitated. Mrs. Gibson is... She's in the room. She's refusing to pack. She says there's been a mistake. I sighed, adjusting my stethoscope around my neck. There's no mistake. I'll handle her. I walked down the hall to room 402 one last time. The door was open. Martha was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she tried to fold a blanket. Robert was sitting in a wheelchair looking out the window at the parking lot. He looked small. The arrogance that had defined him, the swagger of a man who believed he was raising a superstar, was gone. He looked like what he was, a sick, elderly man with no retirement plan. When Martha saw me, she stood up, her face blotchy from days of crying. You can't send him there, Ella, she pleaded, her voice cracking. I looked it up. Gentle Hills, it's a warehouse for old people. The reviews are terrible. The staff ratio is too low. It meets the state standards for care, I replied, leaning against the doorframe. I didn't enter the room. I had no desire to cross that threshold again. It provides dialysis and basic nursing. That is what he needs. But he needs rehabilitation, Martha cried. He needs private therapy. If he goes there, he'll never walk properly again. He'll rot in that chair. She took a step toward me, her hands clasped in a beggar's prayer. Please, you have the authority. Keep him here, just for a few weeks, just until Kyle calls back. I let the silence stretch. Kyle isn't calling back, Martha. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. You don't know that. He's focused. He's under pressure. Once the tryouts are over, I checked the roster online. I interrupted, my voice flat. The tryouts ended yesterday. Kyle didn't make the cut. He was cut in the first round. Robert's head turned slowly from the window. He got cut? Yes, I said. And I imagine he's not calling because he doesn't want to explain to you that the last 10 years of your financial sacrifice were for nothing. He's likely crashing on a friend's couch in Chicago trying to figure out who his next sponsor is going to be. It won't be you. You have nothing left to give him. Martha sank back onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. The truth was a heavy, suffocating blanket. They had gambled everything on one child and treated the other as disposable. Now the wheel had spun and the house had won. They were broke. Their savings had gone to hockey camps, travel leagues, and top-tier gear. They had no long-term care insurance because they assumed Kyle would make it big and buy them a mansion. It was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy of their own design. "We can't afford the facility," Robert whispered, staring at his useless legs. "They'll take the house. Medicaid will take the house." "That is usually how it works," I agreed. "It's the price of independence. You taught me that, remember, you have to make hard choices to balance the budget." Robert looked at me. For the first time, I saw genuine regret in his eyes. Not the regret of getting caught, but the deep, soul-crushing regret of a man realizing he had thrown away the only thing that could have saved him. "We were wrong," he rasped. "Ella, we were so wrong." "I know," I said, "but being wrong has consequences." I pushed off the doorframe. "The transport team will be here in 10 minutes. Goodbye, Robert. Goodbye, Martha." I turned and walked away. Martha screamed my name once, a desperate wailing sound that echoed down the corridor, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I walked past the nurse's station, past the elevators, and toward the main atrium. Waiting for me by the sliding glass doors was Sarah. She was wearing her civilian clothes, a soft blue cardigan and jeans. She held 2 coffees. When she saw me, she didn't ask how it went. She knew. She handed me a cup. "It's done?" she asked. "It's done," I said, taking the coffee. The warmth seeped into my cold fingers. "They're heading to Gentle Hills." Sarah nodded, looking out at the morning sun rising over the city skyline. "It's a nice day," she observed. "It is," I agreed. We walked out through the automatic doors together. The air was crisp and smelled of rain and exhaust, the smell of the city, the smell of life. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs. For 15 years, I had carried a heavy, jagged stone in my chest, the weight of their rejection, the burning question of why wasn't I enough. I thought saving them would fix it. I thought punishing them would fix it. But neither of those things had brought me peace. What brought me peace was walking away. It was realizing that their opinion of me didn't matter. I wasn't the sick girl at the gas station anymore. I was Dr. Ella Gibson. I was a daughter not by blood, but by bond. I looked at Sarah. The sunlight caught the gray in her hair, turning it to silver. She smiled at me, her eyes scrinkling at the corners. "So," she said, bumping my shoulder with hers, "what does the chief of surgery want to do with her day off?" I looked back at the hospital one last time. It was a fortress of science and healing, but it was also just a building. My life was out here. "I want pancakes," I said, smiling for the first time in days. "And then I want to go home." "Pancakes it is," Sarah said, linking her arm through mine. We walked toward her car, leaving the shadow of the hospital behind us. The Gibson family, Robert, Martha, and Kyle, were trapped in a cycle of debt, regret, and mediocrity. They would spend the rest of their lives blaming each other, looking for someone else to pay the bill. But I was free. I had paid my dues. I had survived the infection of their neglect, and I had come out stronger. Resilience isn't about never getting hurt. It's about healing the wound so cleanly that the scar becomes a badge of honor. I touched the small scar above my eyebrow, the one from the fall before they left me. It didn't hurt anymore. It was just a part of me. And as we drove away, leaving the past in the rearview mirror, I finally understood the lesson they had tried to teach me that day at the gas station. They wanted me to be independent. They wanted me to stand on my own 2 feet. Well, I was standing, and I was walking away. Karma has a funny way of balancing the books. Sometimes it takes a week. Sometimes it takes 15 years. But the bill always comes due if you believe that character is built through struggle, and that true family is about who shows up when you have nothing, not just when you have everything. Then leave a comment below. I read every single one. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. Stay safe, stay resilient, and never let anyone tell you your value is a line item in their budget. That concludes Dr. Gibson's journey, proving that sometimes the ultimate victory is simply walking away. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to save your own peace, or found a chosen family who supports you unconditionally? Don't be shy to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.